They thought they could push me around. First came the passive-aggressive warning letters, then the escalating threats about unauthorized modifications to my land. I didn't think much of it at the time. After all, it was just a private well on my property, dug generations ago by my grandfather. It wasn't even visible from a road. No pumps humming, no pipes running to the main lines. Just a quiet, tucked-away source of fresh water I'd used for years without a problem. But to the HOA, that well apparently represented some kind of power struggle. Or maybe it was just a sore spot because I'd refused to hook up to their overpriced preferred utility provider last year. That small act of independence must have rubbed someone the wrong way. It started small. My mailbox got knocked over. Then a random anonymous complaint about my grass being an inch too tall. Then one day, I came home to find an HOA rep taking pictures of the well cap behind my workshop. He pretended to be checking on irrigation compliance. When I asked him what exactly that meant, he just smirked and said, "It's in the charter. You'll see." Then he walked off. I should have taken that as a warning. About a week later, I got a notice taped to my front door. Not mailed, taped. Bold red letters at the top. Final enforcement warning. It claimed I was in violation of the HOA's water resource agreement. I laughed at first. There was no way they could control something that wasn't even connected to their system. But then I read the fine print. They cited some vague clause about unauthorized groundwater access and said they'd be conducting corrective action if I didn't comply within 48 hours. Corrective action? Who even talks like that? I ignored it, assuming it was just more the usual HOA posturing. But then came the real blow. I'd gone into town early that morning to pick up supplies. When I came back, there were fresh tire marks across my property, and my gate, normally locked, was wide open. I knew something was wrong the second I saw the muddy footprints near the well. I ran over, and my stomach dropped. The entire well casing was filled to brim with wet cement. Someone had poured concrete straight into it. I stood there in shock. My only water source, had just been destroyed. The HOA had crossed a line I didn't even think they were capable of crossing. No call, no warning, no legal action, just brute sabotage. I called the sheriff immediately, thinking at least the vandalism would be taken seriously. But when the deputies arrived and saw the HOA tag still left on one of the trucks parked nearby, they shrugged. "Looks like you're in a civil dispute, sir. Not criminal. You'll need to talk to your HOA board." Unreal. They vandalized private property and somehow convinced the law it was within their rights. And just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I got a call from one of the HOA board members. She had the audacity to say, "We tried to warn you. That well wasn't up to community code. You brought this on yourself." I was done playing nice. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. I just thanked her for her call and hung up because I remembered something, a little detail from my days working with the city planning office years ago. See, while the HOA managed community amenities and landscaping, the actual water supply infrastructure, that was still contracted through the city. And guess whose name was still listed as the co-signer on that decades-old agreement? Mine. It turns out, when the neighborhood was first developed, my family owned a large portion of the land. The city had worked out a joint use agreement with us for access to certain water lines. Those contracts had never been updated, and the HOA, they were piggybacking off of it. They thought they had all the power because they had a board and a rule book. But they didn't know I still had the keys to something much bigger. So I pulled out the paperwork. I made a few calls. And I started working on something they'd never see coming. The next morning, I didn't waste time. I opened the old file cabinet in my father's workshop, the one with the rusted handles and faded masking tape labels. Behind a stack of faded property tax receipts, I found it. The original land use agreement signed between my grandfather and the city utilities department. It was yellowed and brittle, but the ink was still clear as day. Right there, in the section marked Municipal Water Rights, was our family name, along with an active clause that gave us joint say over any modifications to the city's water infrastructure within the boundaries of the development. My hands were trembling, but not with fear, with focus. See, When the HOA came along years after the neighborhood expanded, they simply took over maintenance and appearance rules, but they never renegotiated or revoked the underlying water access deal. They had no idea that their entire neighborhood's water supply still ran on a contract tied directly to our family's original plot. I wasn't just a guy with a well. I was a co-owner of the very pipeline that fed their swimming pools, their sprinklers, and every overpriced lawn in the development. That night, I called my friend Terrence, a retired city planner I used to work with. I faxed him a copy of the contract. He called me back 20 minutes later and just said, "Oh man, they messed with the wrong person." We set a meeting with the city utilities board for later that week. In the meantime, I stayed quiet. Let the HOA think they'd won. Let them keep patting themselves on the back for destroying a well that had nothing to do with them. Let them feel powerful. Then came another HOA letter, this one smirking in tone. It read, "Due to your failure to comply with our prior notices, please be advised that further enforcement actions may include property liens or legal fees incurred by the board." That's when I knew for sure these people weren't just arrogant. They were completely unaware of the fire they'd just poked. 3 days later, I walked into the city's utilities department with a folder under my arm and a quiet determination. The boardroom smelled like dry paper and overused air freshener. The city rep, a man in a blue dress shirt and scuffed leather shoes, greeted me like an old friend. "So, you're the guy they shouldn't have messed with," he chuckled. I presented everything. Photos of the vandalized well, the notices from the HOA, the untouched, still legally binding water contract. The room grew quiet as the documents were passed around. One of the legal advisors on staff leaned forward and muttered, "How have they been operating this long without updating this agreement?" The answer was simple: ignorance and ego. The HOA had assumed that because they looked official, they were official. But no one had ever thought to trace the legal roots of the water infrastructure. They hadn't realized their precious community services still ran through a private agreement, one they had zero authority to change without my approval. The utilities director leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. "Well, technically," he said, "you're within your rights to request review or even a temporary suspension if there's evidence of a breach in usage conditions." And I had that. The well, the vandalism, the police refusing to act, the smug phone call from the board member. I wasn't coming in angry. I was coming in with facts. And when you show up calm with legal documents, people listen. Within 2 days, I had a written letter from the city notifying the HOA that their access agreement was under formal review pending a breach investigation. Translation: the water they depended on might be shut off until further notice. The best part? The HOA had no idea it was coming. To them, it was business as usual. They were too busy planning the next round of lawn checks and mailbox inspections to realize they were standing on a ticking clock. I stayed quiet for now. I didn't call them. I didn't gloat. I wanted the moment to hit them the way they hit me, with no warning, no mercy, and no way to undo what had already been done. By the time the letter from the city hit their inbox, the HOA board was deep into planning their summer event schedule, pool parties, lawn competitions, and their annual community unity barbecue. They had no clue the ground was about to shift under them. I imagined the board president, that smug guy with the Bluetooth headset always clipped to his polo collar, opening the email during one of their meetings. Maybe even read it out loud, voice cracking as the words sank in. I wasn't there, of course, but I could picture the scene clearly. The notice was plain and professional. It said the water service contract connected to their community was under formal review. Pending the outcome, non-essential water usage could be limited or temporarily suspended to prevent further legal risk to the city. That included irrigation systems, common area fountains, and, yes, the community pool. Just like that, the HOA's entire sense of control started crumbling. That afternoon, I got a knock on my door. I wasn't surprised to see Diane, the HOA board secretary, standing there with her clipboard. She smiled like nothing had ever happened. "Hi, just checking in. Heard there's been a bit of confusion with the utilities office. We're looking into it. Nothing to worry about." I leaned on the doorframe. Silent, she shifted awkwardly. "You didn't happen to talk to anyone down at City Services, did you? I raised an eyebrow. About what? Oh, there's been some paperwork floating around. Something about joint control. Her smile faltered a little. I didn't answer. Just let the silence settle. Eventually she muttered, right, well, if you do hear anything, let us know. We'd love to, work together on this. Then she turned and walked back to her little golf cart with her clipboard clutched tight against her chest. Not even 24 hours later, I started getting phone calls, not just from board members, but from actual neighbors. People I hadn't spoken to in months suddenly wanted to catch up. One guy, Rick from 2 doors down, called just to say how sorry he was about the whole well situation. He acted like he hadn't voted for every policy the HOA pushed over the last year. Now he was just a homeowner trying to survive the chaos. The real panic started when the fountains in the front roundabout were shut off. It didn't take long after that for the sprinklers in the shared green spaces to dry up. Then came the cancellation of the HOA swim classes, followed by an urgent email blast warning residents to conserve water due to an unexpected maintenance audit. They didn't dare tell the truth. The board wouldn't admit that their water access was hanging by a thread, and that it all traced back to one person, me. Word spread fast. People started asking questions. At first, just whispers. Why are we having shortages? Did someone mess up the payments? Is the city cutting us off? The board danced around the issue, blaming supply chain slowdowns and seasonal restrictions. But that kind of talk only worked for so long. Soon, residents were showing up to the clubhouse demanding answers. And the board, for all their posture and petty enforcement, had nothing solid to say. One guy reportedly shouted, "You fine me $200 for a garbage can, and now you're telling me I can't shower without a schedule?" The anger grew, and I watched it all quietly from my front porch. I didn't need to speak up. The contract, the consequences, the silence from the city, they were speaking louder than I ever could. I'd warned them. I'd asked questions. I'd tried to be reasonable. But instead of listening, they poured concrete into something that wasn't theirs and called the cops on me like I was a criminal. Now the tables had turned, and the HOA, once so loud and sure, was scrambling to control a crisis they never imagined could happen. But the thing is, when you build your power on top of someone else's foundation, you'd better be sure that person isn't still holding the blueprints. One by one, the cracks in the HOA's facade began to show. By the end of the week, they held 2 emergency meetings in the community clubhouse, both packed with frustrated residents demanding to know why their water pressure was dropping and why the pool gates were locked with zip ties. The emails from the board got more desperate, too, first calm and polished, then suddenly riddled with apologies, vague promises, and a lot of "we're working closely with the city to resolve the matter." But they weren't working with anyone. They were begging behind closed doors. See, what they hadn't realized was that the city wasn't just reviewing the water contract. They were now reviewing the HOA itself. My meeting with the utilities board had sparked something bigger. Turns out, the HOA had failed to submit several maintenance compliance documents for the last 2 years. All that time spent sending out warnings about mailbox colors and lawn heights, and they hadn't even kept their infrastructure reports updated. They were so focused on controlling the neighborhood that they forgot to manage their own responsibilities. Meanwhile, I was getting calls from city officials, legal consultants, and even local news reporters. Word had gotten around that a private landowner had triggered an investigation into an HOA's water contract. Some found it funny. Others found it terrifying. A few simply wanted to know how I did it. I didn't answer most of the calls. I wasn't looking for attention. I just wanted accountability. Back in the neighborhood, things continued to spiral. Without water to run the sprinklers, the once pristine medians and community flower beds started browning fast. The HOA tried to hire a private company to truck in water for emergency landscaping, but the quote was outrageous. And when the residents found out it would come from their dues, people snapped. One woman started a petition to audit the HOA spending. Another man posted a video ran online that got shared in the local Facebook groups. The board tried to quiet everyone down with transparency updates, but the damage was already done. Then came the kicker. A neighbor named Luis, who lived on the corner lot, approached me while I was trimming branches near my front fence. He'd always kept to himself, but that morning he walked straight up and said, "Hey, I know you're the one behind all this, and I just want to say thank you." I looked at him, surprised. He explained that the HOA had fined him repeatedly for a non-conforming fence, even though his structure had been there since the house was built. They made him tear it down, then fine him again when he didn't rebuild it fast enough. He'd spent thousands trying to stay compliant, and never once got a straight answer from the board. He wasn't the only one. Over the next few days, I heard from a dozen other neighbors with similar stories. People who'd been bullied, overcharged, or ignored. They weren't cheering for me out loud, but I could see it in their eyes. The tide was turning. Behind the scenes, I kept moving forward. With guidance from the city's legal department, I filed a formal grievance citing willful damage to private infrastructure and unauthorized access to my property. I submitted photos, timestamps, copies of the HOA's notices, and a detailed timeline. It wasn't dramatic. It was just facts, lined up in order, impossible to deny. The city's water office responded by placing a temporary restriction on the HOA's commercial water usage. Not a full cutoff, but enough to cause headaches. Their clubhouse, gym showers, and event fountains were all impacted. They could still get water for residential homes, but everything else was scaled back hard. To avoid being sued by residents, the HOA had to cancel all community events for the summer and issue partial refunds for pool passes. They tried to keep up appearances. Fresh coats of paint on the fences. New banners hung from the clubhouse. But everyone saw the truth. The HOA was bleeding credibility. And as for me, I hadn't raised my voice once. I hadn't posted online or gone knocking door to door. All I'd done was protect what was mine. And in the process, I'd exposed just how weak their grip on the neighborhood really was. It was almost funny watching them scramble to patch the holes they never imagined would show. The same people who once sent violation notices because someone's wind chimes were too reflective were now standing in front of angry crowds, trying to explain why the community splash pad was bone dry and the fountains had gone silent. I kept to my usual routine, mowing my lawn every Sunday, trimming branches on Wednesdays, pretending I didn't notice the way people suddenly waved when they passed by. Funny how the same folks who once looked down on me for refusing to follow community irrigation standards were now curious about how I was still watering my yard. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The truth was already speaking louder than I ever could. The HOA board wasn't just losing control. They were losing face. Their polished image, their glossy newsletters, all that language about preserving community values. It was unraveling fast. I heard rumors that 2 board members had quietly resigned. They weren't announced, just gone, replaced with temporary stand-ins who clearly had no idea what they'd just stepped into. A week after the partial water restriction took effect, I got another visit. This time, it wasn't just Diane. It was the board president himself, Greg, the same guy who once told me in a meeting that individual needs can't override collective order. He showed up in slacks and a sweat-soaked polo shirt, clutching a manila folder like it was a peace offering. "Mind if we talk?" he asked. I didn't invite him in. We stood right there at the edge of my porch, sun beating down on both of us. He handed me the folder, and inside was a letter, official-looking, with all the usual language, acknowledgement of past actions, concern over the current situation, and a request to open a dialogue regarding future cooperative infrastructure usage. In other words, they were asking me to let them back in. I looked him in the eye and asked, "Did you know what they were doing when they filled my well?" His face stiffened. I wasn't involved in that particular decision. As if it had been a group brunch reservation gone wrong. "What do you want from me?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Greg cleared his throat. "We're hoping we can come to a new agreement, one that includes the HOA and the utility access terms. A shared arrangement." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean like the one you already had? Before you destroyed my well?" He had no answer for that. The silence between us stretched. Then he said something that almost made me laugh. "Look, we didn't realize how critical that agreement was. We thought the city handled all of it. That was the problem. They never thought to ask. They just assumed their authority was permanent, assumed their rules couldn't be challenged, assumed I wouldn't push back. They thought because they wore badges and hosted bake sales that they held the keys to the neighborhood. But they didn't. I told Greg I'd consider reviewing a new agreement, but only after a full written apology and financial compensation for the damage done to my well. I also wanted the HOA to publicly acknowledge their mistake, not just in a board meeting, but in writing to the community. That's where he hesitated. Not because of the money, not even because of the apology, but because public acknowledgement meant admitting weakness. And that, for people like him, was worse than a fine. He left that day without giving me a clear answer. Said he'd take it back to the board. But I already knew what that meant. They weren't ready to own up, not yet. They were hoping for a backdoor fix, a quiet agreement, a handshake that would make all of this go away. Except I wasn't interested in letting it go away. Not until it was clear to every single resident that this HOA didn't just cross a line, they cemented it shut. And now they'd have to live with what that really meant. The days rolled by, and while the HOA danced around its apology, the neighborhood kept shifting. You could feel it in the air. What used to be a place of tightly wound compliance and stiff rules now felt looser. People were planting what they wanted in their gardens. Kids were playing outside, without board members driving by in golf carts, scribbling warnings. Some neighbors even stopped hiding their trash cans behind fences. It was small stuff, but it meant everything. I still hadn't heard back from Greg. Not a word from Diane, either. The silence told me exactly what was going on behind those closed doors. They were stuck, weighing their pride against the mess they'd made. They wanted their water access restored without admitting fault. But that wasn't how this was going to work. Then, out of nowhere, I got a letter in the mail. No fancy letterhead, no clipped tone, just handwritten ink on plain lined paper. It was from an elderly resident named Mrs. Patterson. Lived 3 streets over. Barely left her home anymore. She'd written to say thank you. She'd heard about what happened and wanted me to know she'd been fined for having a wheelchair ramp installed without prior community approval. Said it had taken her months to get them to back off. She closed with, "I never knew anyone would stand up to them like this. You made us all feel seen." I read that line twice. Then I folded the paper and slid it into my desk drawer. The next day, I got another knock at the door. This time, it wasn't the board. It was a group of residents, 5 of them. I recognized a few, including Luis, the guy with the fence issues. They didn't waste time with small talk. One of them, a woman named Renee, said, "We're starting a petition to recall the board. We want you to see it first." I raised an eyebrow. "Me?" She nodded. "You're the reason half this neighborhood woke up. The least we can do is keep you in the loop." I didn't say yes or no. I just listened, watched the paper as they passed it around, full of signatures, real names, real people tired of being policed over mailbox shapes and plant heights. Some of these folks had been quietly stewing for years, too afraid to speak up. But now, with the HOA cracking under its own weight, people were finding their voices. Word got out fast. And that's when Greg finally returned, this time via email. Short message, overly formal again. He said the board had reconsidered its position and was willing to meet my terms, including financial compensation and a formal apology. But there was a catch. He asked if, in return, I'd speak at their next board meeting and publicly acknowledge the HOA's efforts to resolve the matter amicably. I read that line over, then leaned back in my chair. They wanted performance. A neat little bow on top of a very messy, very real situation. But I wasn't interested in their public image. I didn't need to be part of some stage show to validate what had already happened. So I replied with one sentence. I'll attend the meeting on my terms. That next Thursday, the board meeting wasn't the usual quiet, echoey session of 4 sleepy residents and a coffee urn. It was packed. Standing room only. The room buzzed before the meeting even began. I walked in through the side, holding the documents I brought with me. The contract, the photos, the timeline. Greg opened with the usual script. We'd like to welcome everyone, especially Mr. Carson, who has agreed to join us in the spirit of resolution. He gestured toward me like we were old friends. I didn't smile. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't grandstand. I simply read to the facts. The unauthorized entry, the damage to the well, the dismissive calls, the water contract, and the slow unraveling that followed. I ended with the exact terms I requested in writing: acknowledgement, repair fees, and a binding agreement that nothing like this would happen again. I didn't stay long after that. I walked out before they even closed the meeting. But by the time I got home, my inbox was full. Neighbors writing, thanking me, asking what came next. Some even asked if I'd consider running for the board. All I could think about was how it all started. Not with a grand plan, not with anger or revenge, but with a well. A quiet old well they thought didn't matter. But it did. 2 days after the meeting, the official notice came. A printed letter slipped into every mailbox in the neighborhood, stamped with the HOA seal and written in that overly polished language they always used. But this time it was different. The letter admitted fault. It acknowledged the incident involving my well, the unauthorized action taken by board members, and the resulting investigation by the city. It even included a formal apology, not just to me, but to every resident for the disruption of services and lapse in proper governance. It was a stunning shift. People actually stood in their driveways reading it like it was a front-page headline. You could feel it. Something big had cracked open. I didn't parade around about it. I didn't need to. By then, the whole neighborhood had already started talking. Families who used to stay silent were now gathering in groups on porches, discussing everything from board mismanagement to how they could make sure it never happened again. You could hear voices that hadn't spoken up in years finally saying things like, "We should have asked more questions," or "Why didn't we vote them out sooner?" Even the community Facebook page, once nothing but passive-aggressive posts about lawn edging and barking dogs, had transformed. Now it was full of screenshots from the city notice, updates on the petition to remove board members, and people sharing their own HOA horror stories. It was as if one crack had let in all the light people had been missing for years. Meanwhile, I kept my focus on the well. I had a contractor out to assess the damage, and it was worse than I thought. The cement had gone deep. It wasn't just a surface plug. It had been poured deliberately, layer by layer, with the intent of full destruction. The repair was going to be expensive, and it would take time. But the city had already agreed to split the cost, and the HOA, under legal pressure, would be covering the rest. I stood there at the edge of the well one morning, watching the crew break through hardened concrete, and thought about how fast everything had changed. How a quiet act of vandalism meant to shut me down had ended up unraveling an entire power structure. A few board members still hadn't shown their faces since the meeting. Rumor was they were waiting out their terms, avoiding public gatherings, hoping the dust would settle. But dust doesn't settle in a place where people finally feel free to speak. One morning, I passed by a neighbor's house and noticed something unusual, a little wooden sign in their yard that read, asterisk, "This land was here before the rules." Asterisk, it wasn't angry or loud, just a quiet reminder. And when they saw me pause to look at it, they smiled and nodded. Even people who'd once backed the HOA blindly were starting to say out loud, "We gave them too much control." The realization didn't come all at once, but piece by piece, after enough dried lawns, locked pool gates, unanswered emails, and unexplained fees. The well had just been the tipping point, the wake-up call. As the weeks passed, more neighbors began showing up to board meetings, asking real questions, not just nodding to the agenda. People volunteered for committee spots. They voted down new fees. They asked for full audits. It wasn't just about removing a few bad apples. It was about reclaiming the orchard. I even started seeing kids ride bikes near the clubhouse again. No security patrolling. No clipboard-wielding board members lurking nearby. Just a little bit of the neighborhood returning to how it used to be, before fear and fines replaced fairness. One afternoon, Luis walked over and handed me something. It was a small plaque, wood-carved with a simple message, asterisk, "Respect your neighbors, or they might know the law better than you." Asterisk. We both laughed. It was a kind of laugh that comes only after a long fight, tired, relieved, and maybe even proud. I didn't ask for this fight. I didn't plan it. I just refused to be quiet when someone crossed a line they never should have touched. And without meaning to, that decision had rippled out a lot farther than I ever expected. It started slow, but once the board realized people weren't afraid anymore, everything began to shift. That next election cycle, half the seats were challenged, and not by the usual clique of polished retirees who treated HOA power like a personal crown, but by normal folks, parents, veterans, young couples. Even one guy who worked night shifts and still showed up to every meeting just to make sure no one got railroaded. I didn't run for anything. I made that clear. I wasn't trying to be in charge. I just wanted fairness to be permanent, not something that only showed up when someone pushed hard enough. But they still asked for my input. I sat in on a few planning calls, helped rewrite some of the outdated policies, and even submitted a proposal to stop HOA inspections from happening without at least 24-hour notice. That one passed without a single objection. You could see it. Trust was slowly rebuilding, but in a different way. Not the kind of trust built on compliance or fear, but something earned, grounded. Neighbors who barely nodded before were now sharing tools, helping each other with weekend projects, asking, "What can I do to help?" It felt like a real neighborhood again, not a monitored zone with matching mailboxes. As for the board members who had pushed things too far, most faded into the background. A few quietly sold their homes. One moved to another state. No one threw them a goodbye party. No one missed their monthly emails. The well, finally repaired, flowed like it always had, clean, steady, dependable. It became more than a source of water. It was a symbol, a reminder. People would walk by and nod toward it, like they knew the story even if they never asked about all the details. One morning, I saw Greg standing near the edge of the park where the community bulletin board had been stripped clean of old notices and replaced with flyers for a summer cookout. He looked different, tired, maybe, or just finally quiet. He saw me watching and walked over, hands in his pockets. "I was wrong," he said without any intro. "About all of it." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. He kept going. "We stopped listening a long time ago. Thought that keeping order meant shutting everyone up." He shook his head. "Didn't realize we were just building a wall around ourselves." There was something genuine in his voice. Not a performance, not a script, just a man who finally understood what power without empathy looked like. Then he said something I didn't expect. "Thanks for not burning it all down. You could have, but you didn't." I looked at him and replied, "I didn't need to. The truth did that on its own." And it had. The truth, quiet and undeniable, had moved faster than any fine or fence regulation ever could. People remembered it. They talked about it. Not like gossip, but like a story with meaning. Like something that reminded them to speak up before it was too late. A few weeks later, I got an invitation tucked into my mailbox. Not from the HOA, but from a group of residents hosting a community barbecue. Real casual. No fees, no checklists, just a handwritten invite. Asterisk, bring a chair. Bring a story. Bring whoever you want. Asterisk. That evening, I showed up with a folding chair, a cooler, and a tired old photo of the well when it was first built, back before the streets were even paved. Folks gathered around and asked about it, eyes wide as I told the story, not with bitterness, but like a lesson passed down, something to remember. Kids played nearby. Neighbors shared plates. No one worried about who had the right brand of mulch or whether someone's hedge was an inch too tall. And just for a moment, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and laughter floated through the air, it felt like something had finally been made right. Not by force, not by control, but by one decision to say, enough. I don't think most people understand how fast power can slip through someone's fingers until it actually does. The HOA started with all the control. They had the rule book, the fines, the enforcement contracts. They had a reputation for being untouchable, even smug about it. You could feel it in every cold notice left on the door, every board meeting where questions were met with sighs instead of answers. They believed they could get away with anything, including destroying someone's private water source in broad daylight. But power like that only works when people stay quiet. when no one asks questions, when fear keeps everyone in line. The moment someone pushed back with facts and legal backing, their whole system cracked. And the real surprise? It wasn't just my fight. Once the damage was exposed, dozens of others realized they'd been quietly pushed around for years, fined for paint colors, threatened over flower beds, harassed for parking too close to a curb. One guy got 3 letters in a month about the size of his mailbox flag. Another woman was forced to remove her backyard shed, even though she had a sign permit from the city. They all just accepted it, thinking there was no other choice. That's how the HOA stayed strong, not by fairness, but by conditioning the community to expect punishment for the smallest things. What happened with my well wasn't an accident. It was just the first time they went too far with someone who had the means to fight back. After the repairs were done and the city confirmed the revised water access agreement, I thought things might settle down. But they didn't. Not completely. Something had changed, not just in the HOA structure, but in the way people looked at each other. Neighbors started comparing letters they received. They started organizing small groups to review policy language. People were actually reading the HOA charter, not just accepting whatever version was being handed down from the board. At the next community meeting, instead of silence or scattered claps, people showed up with questions. They didn't just nod through the agenda. They challenged vague policies. They asked for explanations. One woman brought her laptop and projected the actual city code on the wall. You could almost feel the board shrink in their chairs. There was no going back to how things were. Even the atmosphere on the street changed. People waved more. They lingered outside with neighbors instead of retreating inside at the first sign of clipboard patrols. And it wasn't just about rules or revenge. It was about balance. Finally, people understood they were supposed to have a say, not just receive instructions. They weren't just members of a neighborhood. They were owners of it. One evening, I walked out the mailbox and found a small envelope with my name on it. Inside was a simple card. No return address. No signature. Just 2 words written in neat cursive. Thank you. That meant more than any official apology ever could. Around that same time, the city sent a representative to assess the state of local HOAs in the region. Turns out, complaints were up across the county. And apparently, mine wasn't the only one where residents had started pushing back. What happened here had made the rounds, not just on social media, but through community networks, city planning forums, and neighborhood watch groups. I hadn't set out to be an example. I hadn't planned a movement. All I did was defend something that mattered to me, and do it the right way. No screaming, no vandalism, just a careful chain of facts, pressure, and timing. I used the same tools they had, rules and systems. But this time, they were aimed back at the ones who'd abused them. The most ironic part? After everything, the fines, the sabotage, the police being called on me, it took just one line in a decades-old contract to bring the whole thing down. One overlooked detail they assumed didn't matter. But it mattered. And that's the thing people forget when they get too comfortable with power. It only takes one person, standing on the right ground, to remind them how fragile that power really is.